Welcome everyone to the second session of this conference on Quinn, D. Michael Quinn. My name is Barber Jones-Brown. I am the new director, company director at Signature Books, and I'm really privileged and honored to be asked by Ben to host this session today. Our first presenter will be Patrick Mason. Patrick is an associate professor of religious studies and history at Utah State University, where he holds the Leonard J. Arrington Chair of Mormon History and Culture. He is the author or editor of several books, including Mormonism and Violence, The Battles of Zion Out of Obscurity, Mormonism Since 1945, and What is Mormonism? A Student's Introduction. So without further ado, Patrick.
Thanks, Barbara, and thanks to Ben for putting on such an amazing conference. That first panel was just phenomenal. So thanks to all of you for being here. I also have to give a shout out to my research assistant, Hovan Lawton. He's a master's student at USU who helped me with the research and putting this together. So I'm grateful to him. So by almost any measure, the leadership of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and especially its all-male elite priesthood hierarchy, was the central concern of D. Michael Quinn's influential career as one of Mormonism's leading historians. Certainly, his contributions in other areas were substantial, as we'll hear about on the rest of the panel. But an intense personal interest that began as a 9-year-old boy and eventually resulted in the production of an MA thesis, PhD dissertation, 5 books, and numerous articles, all focused primarily on documenting the personalities, processes, and perils attendant to the Mormon hierarchy. Quinn's fascination with the leadership of the LDS Church was evident early on. He wrote his 1973 master's thesis at the University of Utah on the topic of organizational development and social origins of the Mormon hierarchy, 1832 to 1932. His doctoral dissertation, completed 3 years later, was similarly titled The Mormon Hierarchy, 1832 to 1932, An American Elite. This work would become the basis for his 3-volume Mormon Hierarchy series. The arguments remained substantially similar, even while his later published books compounded additional evidence and examples for support. Along the way, he also published 2 biographies of J. Reuben Clark. Rather than treating each of these works individually, I want to highlight a few key themes that I think cut across all of Quinn's work on the Mormon hierarchy. First, Quinn argued that the distinctive features of Latter-day Saint leadership had scriptural origins. As he stated in his dissertation, the essential starting point for Mormon political theory is within the standard works of LDS scripture. Now, on one level, this seems an utterly unremarkable statement. Just as scholars often look to the Hebrew Bible, New Testament, and Quran to illuminate the respective origins and nature of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim organizational and leadership structures, Mormon studies scholars frequently turn to Joseph Smith's revelatory productions to identify the origins of various aspects of Mormon thought and practice. Yet Quinn was often content to stop at what scripture said and not explore what other cultural or religious influences may have impacted the original notions and development of Latter-day Saint leadership. Largely ignoring these broader contexts was a conscious decision on Quinn's part. In the introduction to Extensions of Power, he wrote that early in his career, he had planned on situating his findings on the Mormon hierarchy, both theoretically within elite theory and political science, and comparatively with group biographies of elites in various enterprises and cultures. Other scholars encouraged him to apply organizational behavior theory, the anthropology or sociology of religion, or religious studies theory. Quinn determined, however, that it is necessary to establish the data before seeking context. That's a quote. His would be a primarily descriptive project. I leave it to others, he said, to provide the comparative analysis and new insights based on the data he compiled and published. In this respect, many other scholars have offered readers far more by way of the broader context for the development of early Mormon structures and hierarchies, tracing various secular and religious counterparts, parallels, and influences. Social scientists have weighed in with useful theoretical models, such as Michael McBride's analysis of authority in Mormonism using rational choice theory. In short, the world of Quinn's Mormon hierarchy was exhaustively detailed, but curiously self-defining. Second, Quinn was always interested in complicating what official church histories had often presented as a rather flat narrative of continuity and consistency. Quinn's writings on Mormon leadership were always attendant to change over time. Generally, this meant a trend toward increased hierarchy, theocracy, and bureaucratization. In the very first issue of the Journal of Mormon History, Quinn echoed Thomas O'Day's characterization of Mormonism as evolving from master-disciple relationships to a more organized hierarchy. 10 years later, he wrote in Dialogue that the religion shifted from authoritarian democracy to an authoritarian oligarchy. Quinn was especially troubled by what he and others identified as a marked shift towards centralized authority beginning in the 1960s, centered doctrinally or at least discursively on a new emphasis on the quasi-infallibility of Mormon prophets. For the most part, Quinn was content to document these trends rather than to theorize them. It was Armin Moss who most famously made theoretical sense of the move toward retrenchment in the last third of the 20th century. Third, official church histories have emphasized harmony among the senior leadership, with the occasional acknowledgement of selected early dissidents whose role in the narrative is primarily to further underscore the importance of loyalty to God's chosen prophets. You need black hats to emphasize the white hats. As part of the vanguard of the new Mormon history, Quinn was a pioneer in documenting the persistent and sometimes debilitating conflicts that existed within and between the church's presiding quorums. He suggested that much, if not most, of this conflict occurred because of overlapping and sometimes unclear ecclesiastical jurisdictions that later got sorted out, sometimes only to create new conflicts. Quinn was one of the first to pull back the curtain on the internal conflict and contestation that existed among the senior leadership for the church's first century and a half. Perhaps only Gary Bergera and Greg Prince have made similarly significant contributions in this area. Fourth, to a degree that I would suggest has not been paralleled by any other scholar, Quinn traced the dynastic elements present in senior church quorums throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Interestingly, however, Quinn generally defended the church's leadership from charges of simple nepotism. In Extensions of Power, he argued that the dynasticism present among the senior leadership was not only to be expected, given how small the movement was at first and the doctrinal emphasis on family ties and relationships, but also that it contributed additional unity, stability, and loyalty to the movement. He pointed to excommunications and other disciplinary measures taken toward individual leaders from prominent families and affirmed that personal worthiness was the most important consideration in the selection of senior church leaders. Fifth, although he researched and wrote in an era in which the American historical profession had made a decisive turn towards social history, cultural history, women's history, and African-American history, Quinn produced an impressive and foundational catalog of scholarship, which by and large kept the beliefs and behaviors of elite white men at the center of Mormon history. That there are almost no people of color in his writings may be understandable in a series of studies on the first century and a half of Mormon leadership. That there are virtually no women present is a telling definition of what counts as Mormon leadership. It's not like the data was unavailable to him. Quinn had access to all of the documents that Jill Durr, Carol Cornwall Madsen, and other pioneering LDS women's historians did. He simply chose to focus very nearly exclusively on the male priesthood elite. Finally, while he could be unsparing in his criticism of church hierarchs, whether it be the violence of 19th century leaders or the objectification of individuals that he saw in the principal architects of Mormonism baseball baptism era, generally speaking, Quinn's portrayal of church leadership was sympathetic. With a few exceptions, he saw their motivations as being grounded in sincere religiosity and a genuine desire to build the kingdom of God in anticipation of Jesus Christ's second coming. This was perhaps most evident in the third and final volume of the Mormon Hierarchy series, the 2017 volume on wealth and corporate power, that many expected to be an expose of institutional corruption and personal enrichment. Instead, critics were disappointed to learn that Quinn's own characterization of his 4-decade investigation into church finances was ultimately, in his own words, an enormously faith-promoting story. When assessing Michael Quinn's historiographical legacy, this last point should not be underemphasized. If during the course of Quinn's life, historians doubled as theologians within the LDS Church, just because of lack of better options, then Quinn was the church's preeminent historian theologian of the belief that LDS prophets and apostles are simultaneously fallible and followable. In his opening to both of his J. Reuben Clark biographies, Quinn made the following statement. Here I'm quoting from his 2002 volume, Elder Statesman, which was published nearly a decade after his excommunication. I should disclose my own belief that the general authorities of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are called to their positions by divine guidance, and I am confident that they seek to carry out their administrative responsibilities by that inspiration. I also believe in the important truth expressed by President Clark to LDS religion teachers at Brigham Young University. Yet we must not forget that prophets are mortal men with men's infirmities. Quinn wrote his Clark biography and arguably his entire corpus on Mormon leadership, trying to maintain this balanced viewpoint which Clark recommended. In this respect, I would suggest that Michael Quinn's scholarship on LDS elites was fundamentally conservative. I mean this not in the political or theological sense. Indeed, if you're a big fan of Ezra Taft Benson, you're not going to find a lot to appreciate in Quinn's treatment of him. What I mean instead is that Quinn's abundant body of work on LDS leadership was conservative in the broader sense of preserving the authority and integrity of traditional structures and relationships. He wrote about white religious elite males, traced the origin of LDS leadership structures to God, assumed the best intentions of most leaders, sympathized with the outcomes of their decision-making even when things turned out poorly, and critiqued a turn toward authoritarianism, whether in Brigham Young or Boyd K. Packer, that he saw as betraying the true, essential, divinely revealed nature of prophetic leadership in Christ's restored church. Now, I'm generally hesitant about psychohistory, except when it's useful for my purposes. So here we go. I would suggest that Michael Quinn was so fascinated, at times seemingly obsessed, by Mormon leaders, precisely because for much of his life, he fully expected to become one himself. At the impressionable age of 9, his grandmother told him that he would become an LDS apostle someday. Now, if everyone whose grandmother thinks that they're going to grow up to be an apostle really became one, we'd have a quorum of like 1,200,000, not just 12. But Quinn truly took his grandmother's words to heart. In January 1973, just as he was beginning his career as a historian in earnest, Quinn sought out Spencer W. Kimball, then president of the Quorum of 12 Apostles, for a counsel and a blessing. The 29-year-old Quinn specifically wanted Kimball to provide relief from his unrelenting thoughts of becoming an apostle and seeking church office. Those are his words, which Quinn interpreted as an expression of my lifelong pride and arrogance. When at the end of their hour-long meeting, Kimball laid his hands on the young historian's head, the blessing he pronounced was not the one Quinn sought. Rather than releasing him of his anxiety-producing expectations, Quinn later remembered, instead, he promised me that I would one day be an apostle. Quinn was devastated, as was his wife, he reported, who he said sobbed for hours upon hearing Mike's report of the meeting. Quinn sincerely believed that Spencer W. Kimball was an apostle of the Lord. While the apostle's blessing defied any rational understanding, even 4 decades later, Quinn still testified with more than a little echo of Joseph Smith, I don't expect anyone else to understand that experience, but I can't doubt it. I certainly don't understand it, but I can't doubt the inspiration that he gave. It doesn't take great effort or imagination to connect the dots between Quinn's psyche and spiritual expectations, prophetically confirmed at the beginning of the year in which he would write his master's thesis, and his lifelong interest in the Mormon hierarchy. Whether at the front or the back of his mind, Quinn's scholarship on church leadership seems to have been in part an effort to document the history of the group of elites he anticipated one day being a part of. Michael Quinn's scholarship illuminates and embodies the paradox that has haunted liberal and progressive Mormons ever since the 1960s. How does one espouse democratic, inclusive values while believing in, participating in, and writing about a religious system that concentrates power in an all-male ecclesiastical hierarchy? Though bravely piloting a number of pioneering low-orbit flights that offer crucial perspectives, Quinn could never quite escape the powerful gravitational pull of the male LDS priesthood hierarchy. It is, admittedly, an extremely vexing task, one that our very best scholars continue to grapple with. It's not just any hierarchy that's built into the Mormon ecclesiastical system. It is a distinctly gendered and heteronormative hierarchy, one that was also deeply racialized for most of Mormon history and arguably still today. The entire Mormon historical community owes an enormous debt to D. Michael Quinn for his pioneering, forthright, and often courageous scholarship, exploring, in his words, the previously uncharted terrain of the Mormon hierarchy's experience. Now, a generation later, it's our task to do exactly what he called for, to provide the comparative analysis and new insights that are yielded from deep engagement with archival sources, what Quinn was so unbelievably good at, plus the contextual, intersectional, and theoretically informed work that characterizes the best of the new Mormon studies scholarship. But no matter what comes next in the study of the Mormon hierarchy and leadership, D. Michael Quinn's influence looms so large that his name will always appear in more than a few footnotes, a fact that I expect will make him very happy indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Our next presenter will be joining us from New Zealand. Ian Barber is Associate Professor in the Archaeology Program, University of Otago, Dunedin, New Zealand. His research interests extend to the historical anthropology of Mormonism and Mormon studies more broadly. Within the field, he has published on the legacy of Mormon treasure seeking in Western dream mine expressions, women as seers, and cultural change and tension in Polynesian Latter-day Saints communities, especially New Zealand Maori. Between 2018 and 2019, Ian was the Marlon K. Jensen Scholar in Residence in the Tanner Humanities Center here at the University of Utah, where he developed and taught a history class, Mormons and the Past. I'll be sharing the digital presentation of Ian's. Okay, got it. Share screen. Good.
Wait, no, wrong one.
No, sorry.
It's fine.
Tēnā koutou katoa. That's a warm Māori greeting from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I have the pleasure.
Just a second. Is this not turning on? Come on, turn on. There we go.
Tēnā koutou katoa. That's a warm Māori greeting from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I have the pleasure to be joining you from today in this pre-recorded presentation. Kia ora also to Barbara as session chair, with thanks in anticipation of any nice things you might have said about me. I want to begin just with a brief acknowledgement of
We're going to start over just so you get the beginning.
Tēnā koutou katoa. That's a warm Māori greeting from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I have the pleasure to be joining you from today in this pre-recorded presentation. Kia ora also to Barbara as session chair, with thanks in anticipation of any nice things you might have said about me. I want to begin just with a brief acknowledgement of Mike Quinn and his importance to me in my life. My involvement with Mike began in a letter I wrote from Aotearoa as a precocious, young, late 20th century Mormon high school convert with questions about esoteric church doctrine and history. To my great surprise, I received a very full letter back from this important BYU historian. On finally meeting Mike when I first visited Salt Lake City, we struck up a personal friendship as well as a professional relationship. I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to catch up with Mike as recently as 2019, and honoured to be asked to contribute to an important event that remembers the life and work of someone who so many of us hold so dear. My thanks also to Ben Park for his fantastic work in bringing this conference together, and for Ben's invitation to me to contribute. Now, my brief from Ben has been to consider Mike's monumental study on magic as a contribution to the dynamic research field of early Mormonism and the magic worldview. I'm going to focus on the later 20th century, when both editions of Mike's book were published, 1987, and the revised expanded edition, 1998. This focus is because of time constraints in part. Here, however, one should acknowledge at least that we now have in the 21st century the Joseph Smith Papers project, making original sources available in new clarity, accuracy, and accessibility, and that other important source documents have been published or republished from the 1990s into this current century, none more significant perhaps for early Mormon studies than Dan Vogel's monumental and comprehensive Early Mormon Documents series, published by Signature Books. Now, I acknowledge all of that, as well as important scholarship by people like Richard Bushman, Mark Ashurst McGee, Dan Vogel, others in the 21st century. And I don't mean to be in any way dismissive of that important work, but it is my thesis also that contemporary Mormon scholarship on Mormon origins and magic remains substantially reliant on the original thinking and research on this topic of the late 20th century, including Mike's tome. And I will argue, in fact, that there are two models that one can define which from that period that I think continue to characterize studies in the field. Now, the original substantive documentary treatment of the influence of magic on Joseph Smith was E. Howe's 1834 Mormonism Unveiled, as many of you are aware. Howe published edited affidavits collected by an ex-Mormon with the absolutely fabulous name of Dr. Philastus Hurlbut, a name that would not be out of place among the wizards of a Harry Potter novel. Hurlbut collected his affidavits in the early 1830s, from Smith's neighbours. These describe the Smiths' employment of magic rituals and instruments to discover and recover buried treasure and or antiquities. Now, until the 1960s, Orthodox Latter-day Saints scholars such as Hugh Nibley dismissed the Howe affidavits, pointing to source inconsistencies and evidence of editorial manipulation. Less orthodox scholars from the Mormon tradition, like Dale Morgan and Fawn Brodie, accepted the affidavits as credible by and large. Brodie's influential Joseph Smith biography also mirrored a dismissive modern attitude towards the magic culture that influenced the Smiths. For Brodie, quote, "Most bucolic scryers are ignorant, superstitious folk who believe profoundly in their mineral rods and rabbits' feet, end of quote. Latter-day Saints historians would reassess this magic worldview and its influence on Joseph Smith from the late 1960s in the context of a renaissance of Mormon scholarship. A key stimulus was the discovery of the original bill of costs from an 1826 trial of Joseph Smith the Glasslooker by the Reverend Wesley Walters, an indefatigable researcher. Accounts of the 1826 trial had circulated from the late 19th century, accepted as valid by Brodie as historical sources, rejected by Nibley. BYU historian Marvin Hill reanalyzed the trial documents in a brief 1972 article published in BYU Studies. He confirmed many contradictions in the extant accounts and added that if the bills should prove authentic and support the idea that, quote, an element of mysticism, unquote, led Smith and other Mormons to search for buried treasure, quote, it does not disprove the genuineness of their religious convictions, unquote. In this view, Smith's participation in the magic world of treasure was epiphenomenal to his authentic religious quest. And I characterize this approach as the magic as periphery model of Joseph Smith's religious career. Magic as periphery became the position of most Mormon historians until 1984. This is well exemplified by two church histories published in the 1970s from the newly formed historical department under the relatively brief decade in which Leonard Arrington served as church historian from 1972. In Story of the Latter-day Saints, published in 1976 by Deseret Book, marketed for a church audience, historians Allen and Leonard characterized Joseph Smith's search for buried treasure as one of his curious sidelines. In 1979, church historians Arrington and Davis Bitton published The Mormon Experience with Knopf, targeting both non-Mormon and Mormon readerships. These historians critiqued Howe's affidavits as deficient and contradictory, but allowed that it has not been possible to reject the affidavits entirely, and in this respect, they cited the records of the 1826 trial. In 1977, Joseph Smith biographer Donna Hill, Marvin Hill's sister, also summarized the 1826 trial evidence and other early Mormon evidence to conclude that Joseph had accepted treasure-seeking myths, quote, to some extent, unquote. Anticipating arguments to come, Hill added that respected citizens and churchgoers dug for treasure in Western New York as well as New England and saw, quote, no conflict between that and their religious convictions, unquote. In 1984, Mormon historian Richard Bushman's first major study of Joseph Smith and Mormon origins concluded that Joseph Smith Sr. was the lead in the family's treasure-seeking experiments and activities, stimulated by his son's supernatural experiences. Bushman argued further that Joseph had misgivings soon after helping Josiah Stahl look for Spanish treasure and did not like treasure hunting. For many faithful scholars of these periphery views, the publication of Mormon anthropologist John Sorensen's 1984 Case for an Ancient American Setting of the Book of Mormon may have reinforced a theoretical separation of Joseph's contemporary magic world and materials and the materiality of a purportedly pre-Columbian Book of Mormon record. And it is interesting in that regard that Leonard Arrington was lead author of the book's affirming preface. Now, the interpretive ground would shift for several key Mormon scholars as a result of the initial, if tentative, acceptance of Mark Hoffman's forgeries, especially the fraudulent Martin Harris or so-called White Salamander letter. In these documents, treasure-seeking directions and magical themes were intruded into the events around the recovery of the Book of Mormon and Joseph's ministry, including the purported account of a salamander spirit appearing as Joseph attempted to recover the plates. In 1986, a much-delayed special issue of BYU Studies, with a publication date of 1984, considered new work on the magic worldview and its influence on early Mormons, as stimulated by the Hoffman documents, yet to be confirmed as forgeries. Hoffman pleaded guilty in January 1987. Smith Institute historian Ronald Walker proposed that the question before scholars was, quote, no longer if Joseph and his family participated in the cunning arts, but the degree and meaning of their activity, unquote. For BYU Professor of Ancient Scripture Richard Lloyd Anderson, it was the periphery view that prevailed. For Anderson, the mature spiritual purposes evident in Joseph's later religious work reduced, quote, any treasure seeking to a transitory exploring function for the prophet's life, unquote. But in the same issue, Marvin Hill saw elements of the recovery of the Book of Mormon record as described by Lucy Mack Smith and other very early followers as, quote, very similar to the money-digging folklore, end of quote. For Hill, the ground had shifted clearly since his cautious 1972 interpretation of the 1876 trial. Hill suggested that for these early followers, revealed religion and magic served similar purposes as reassuring evidence of God's power. Walker also opined, we may find New England folk culture was not an inappropriate precursor to the Restoration, with its strong embrace of the idea of personal revelation and the ministry of spirits. Walker observed further that, quote, with Providence's intervention, Joseph Smith transformed himself from Joseph the Palmyra seer, who likely understood his early experiences in one way, his early religious experiences in one way, to the mature Joseph the Mormon prophet, who saw them in quite a different light, end of quote. In these views, Joseph Smith's magical 1820s worldview, with its treasure-seeking, became a passage of supernatural engagements that would lead to Smith's prophetic role in a restored Church of Christ. I've designated this the passage model. Now, in 1985, religious studies scholar Jan Ships also published an interpretation of the young Joseph Smith that was compatible with the passage model. Ships picked up a theme from her earlier 1974 article, which would be quoted approvingly by Mike in his study, in which Joseph's treasure-seeking, quote, played an important role in his spiritual development, end of quote. Now this brings us to Mike's monumental study of early Mormonism and magic that followed and enhanced the passage model. Mike explored the idea that Joseph had developed his inward spirituality as a treasure seer rather than a treasure digger. For the former, for the treasure seer, the primary reward, Mike said, was expanding his or her seeric gift to the point that the seer might absent themselves from the actual treasure quest. Joseph, among other seers of 1820s Palmyra, Mike wrote, quote, soon became remarkable for the manner in which he dramatically expanded the religious dimensions inherent in folk magic. This was most definitely a passage interpretation. Now, a review of the first edition of Mike's book by BYU folklorist William Wilson critiqued what Wilson saw as Mike's folk assumption of a division between the, quote, educated or cultivated who abandoned old ways for more rationalistic perspectives, and the folk who adhered to those old ways. For contemporary folklorists, William Wilson argued, there is no monolithic, unchanging group of people called the folk. There are instead many folks constantly changing. Mike took umbrage at Wilson's review in his second edition. He defended his use of folk magic, but he also responded somewhat defensively that early Mormonism did not exclude elites from the magic worldview. And indeed, the first edition, to be fair, had acknowledged that prominent and wealthy Americans participated in the treasure quest as well. Mike sought to make the point clear in a couple of texts in the second edition. As well as that, Mike added what I think is an incredibly important paragraph in this second edition, and I'm going to conclude with this. In the last quarter of the 20th century, the LDS Church became increasingly authoritarian and obsessed with conformity, including a complete repudiation of the occult. Moreover, liberal Mormons are rarely attracted to folk religion and folk magic, despite the latter's anti-institutional emphasis. Here, in short, Mike is critical of the conformist but also critical of the liberal Mormon approach. Both of those views, Mike suggested, created a very hostile environment for the survival of esoteric beliefs and behavior. From the perspective of institutional control, that is a victory. From the perspective of human diversity, it is a loss. Now, Mike, of course, had experienced personally the hostility of a conformist organization towards difference and diversity. And from the perspective of esoteric beliefs, I'm mindful of this also, especially this week. I've just submitted a chapter to a book, and my chapter considers, among other things, the beliefs of practicing Māori Latter-day Saints and ancestral animal guardians, beliefs maintained alongside belief in the Anglo-American and Judeo-Christian deities and angels of Mormonism. Now, Mike's study reminds us that religious experience and expectations are culturally grounded and potentially quite diverse, and that is illustrated in extraordinarily fine detail as Mike explores the magic worldview and the relationship of the magic worldview and spiritual experiences as they continued within the Mormon tradition. The need to both understand and sincerely respect that rich spiritual diversity, I think, becomes an important consideration for a global church today. To repeat Mike's point, where we do not respect that diversity, it is a loss. In short, that evidence of spiritual complexity and diversity in the Mormon tradition can hopefully be a means today of encouraging a contemporary community, a contemporary church community, to look with greater respect and understanding on the multiple spiritualities that are becoming incorporated within the Mormon movement from diverse global peoples, including and most especially indigenous communities, as well as those indigenous communities such as Polynesians and Native Americans who have been long-standing church members for decades or more, whose spiritualities have too frequently been dismissed and overlooked by Anglo-American Mormon missionaries and church leaders. Now, I want to conclude with a Māori tribute to the memory of Mike Quinn as both a great man and a dear friend. When a rangatira, a mighty leader, passes, it is said, "Kua hinga te totara I te wao nui a Tāne." The totara, a mighty tree, has fallen in the forest of Tāne, the god of the forests. For me, professionally and personally, a mighty tree has fallen in the field of Mormon studies with the passing of Mike Quinn, leaving a gap that will never be filled. Haere rā e hoa. Farewell, my friend.
Thank you, Ian. Our next presenter is Katie, or K initial Mohrman, and that's spelled Mohrman. She, her pronouns, is a clinical teaching assistant professor of ethnic studies, women and gender studies, and religious studies at the University of Colorado, Denver. Trained as an interdisciplinary scholar of U.S. popular culture and politics, with a particular focus on Mormon history and religion, the central concern of her research is with the role of sexuality and gender in processes of racialization, biopolitical governance, and settler colonialism. Her book, Exceptionally Queer, Mormon Peculiarity and U.S. Nationalism, forthcoming from University of Minnesota Press, examines how discourse about Mormonism has functioned as a form of US exceptionalism, which has helped establish and maintain racial hierarchy in the US, largely through reference to sexual and gender normativity. Okay.
I heard there was some speculation about my last name and if it was pen name. It's not, it really is my name. It's just that lucky. So I want to start by saying thanks to Ben for all his hard work in, can you hear me? Sorry. I want to say thanks to Ben for all his hard work in organizing this conference and bringing everyone together. I'm really happy to be here. I'll also preface by saying that he gave me a brief of talking about Quinn's work in gender and sexuality studies and kind of a survey of the field now and how that looks, what's his influences. And he said specifically, be provocative. I took that seriously, so we'll see how that goes. So I want to start my remarks with an anecdote about my one and only interaction, or it's more appropriately called an almost interaction, with D. Michael Quinn. I begin with this briefly sketched scene because it serves as a kind of self-positioning, a practice critical for feminist and queer scholars such as myself, and one that Quinn himself regarded as important. But I also begin here because I believe it functions as a relevant metaphor for what it means to attempt to bring Mormon studies into conversation with outside fields, disciplines, and critical theoretical frameworks. And what I'm finding is perhaps more difficult to bring those fields, disciplines, and theories into taking Mormonism seriously. So in the summer of 2012, I found myself having just completed my first year of my PhD program, sitting in this university's J. Willard Marriott Library Special Collections reading room. A queer non-Mormon woman who had grown up in Mormon-dominated Utah and who was training in a post-nationalist American studies program that had little and almost no focus on religion, I was attempting to find my own way through what it meant to study queerness in Utah. Thus, that summer, with the support of a research grant, I was visiting several archives in Salt Lake, looking for material related to the practice, conceptualization, and management of non-normative sex in 19th century Utah. With hindsight, this focus was inevitably channeled toward an examination of how the church had conceptualized, approached, and handled questions of same-sex sex and sexuality. My research unavoidably veered in this direction, largely because the guiding light that kept me from stumbling around in the proverbial dark of the archives was the assiduously and painstakingly detailed documentation of primary sources Quinn had undertaken in same-sex dynamics. What has been frequently characterized as the over-documentation of his text, we've heard some of that today, is an aspect that several reviewers, but specifically reviewers outside of Mormon studies, deemed curious and perhaps even a detraction from Quinn's thesis. Indeed, one reviewer commented, quote, Quinn's text is 203 of the 487 total pages. There are 206 pages of footnotes and a 40-page index. This over-documentation, in my opinion, is unnecessary. The argument is persuasive without listing 30 or 40 sources for a single point. I think it's safe to say that we here understand why Quinn felt it was necessary to complete such an exhaustive documentation, given the religious, cultural, academic, and political context into which the book emerged and to which it was responding. Moreover, this detailed documentation allows researchers, fledgling as I was at the time, or not, to follow through on their own related lines of investigation, something I couldn't have done at the time, even with digital access. It's also a practice I have striven to emulate in my own forthcoming work. This is not to promote or privilege historical methods that put a premium on written, archival, quote unquote, evidence, since that all too easily erases the voices and experiences of a variety of marginalized folks, especially women and LGBTQ people of color, as noted by Gina Colvin in the roundtable discussion on challenging Mormon race scholarship published in the Journal of Mormon History. But I'm digressing. As I sat there at my designated table one August afternoon, combing through boxes and folders of material with his footnotes as my guide, I looked up to see Quinn himself walking to the archivist's desk to exchange boxes. To put it bluntly, and embarrassingly, I was starstruck. There I was, conducting my own research under Quinn's guidance, albeit unknown, and there he was, conducting his own research for what I assumed, given the timing, was Wealth and Corporate Power, the third volume of his Extensions of Power series. I sat there amazed at seeing an academic celebrity of Mormon studies, something that my peers in the American Studies department at the University of Minnesota would have never understood, since they kept asking me, why are you studying Mormonism? So I sat there too afraid to get up and introduce myself. And I regret to say that I never did get up, but I remained conspicuously aware of his presence for the rest of the afternoon as a marked up and dog-eared copy of his book lay hidden in my bag. And that same copy is in my bag right now. Now, I need to be honest here, as much as I was starstruck by Quinn, and it truly was, since here was someone who had written one of the only major works on gay and lesbian Mormon history at the time, but I was also critical of some of his theoretical choices in same-sex dynamics. While I was amazed someone had done this work, I was also disappointed that he hadn't gone further in his analysis. Quinn was clearly aware of and engaged in what were then in the early 1990s, timely academic discussions around what it meant to research and write gay and lesbian history, in debates over what exactly constituted the history of sexuality, and in dialogues about what it meant to contend that sexuality is socially constructed. This was encapsulated in his statement in the introduction to same-sex dynamics that, quote, even my use of sexuality is a product of my culture, unquote. However, in my view, he nevertheless retained what I would characterize as a somewhat uncritical attachment to both sexuality and gender as concepts. While Quinn's work was clearly attentive to what gay and lesbian historian Jeffrey Weeks called sexuality's relationships to, quote, the workings of power in contemporary society, unquote, specifically to how conceptualizations of sexuality were structured by religious institutions and leaders and how those changed over time, Quinn was surprisingly inattentive to sexuality's relationship to other social categories, including class, gender, and most importantly, in my mind, race. This is reflected in another reviewer's disappointment with what he called Quinn's quote unquote simplistic explanation that the major decline in the church's relatively tolerant attitudes towards homosexuality changed between the 19th and 20th centuries as a result of, quote, the rise of a leadership born in the early 20th century, leaving almost any informed reader unsatisfied, unquote. While other scholars have since stepped in to offer other explanations for this change in attitude and approach, myself and Taylor Petrie included, at the time I was left unsatisfied as well, sensing that this change could not be explained without an intersectional approach. Now, I don't include a discussion of my criticism of Quinn's text just for the sake of criticism, nor do I want to hold Quinn to anachronistic standards given the developments in gender and sexuality studies in the 26 years since the publication of his book. To do so would be unfair and it would be ludicrous. Rather, I do so because I think part of what held me back from talking to Quinn that day in the archives was my critique of his work when that should have done just the opposite, driven me to engage him. This feeds directly into a series of questions with which I have grappled since the beginning of my graduate studies and have remained intrigued by as an interdisciplinary scholar who is committed to feminist, queer, and other kinds of critical theory, and is also located at the intersections of Mormon, religious, American, ethnic, gender, and sexuality studies. Why isn't religion, and specifically Mormonism in this case, taken seriously beyond religious studies, specifically American religious history in particular? How can religion be conceptualized and engaged fully, not just as a, quote, stultifying, oppressive institution of a homophobic, sexist social order, unquote? Those words come from queer studies religious scholar Melissa Wilcox. On the flip side of these questions, how can Mormon studies more deeply and consistently engage the theoretical frameworks, developments, and insights of gender, sexuality, and ethnic studies? A survey of the current state of the field in gender and sexuality studies suggests that despite contributions like Quinn's and other feminist Mormon studies work in the years since, these dynamics are strongly at play, repeating patterns that have long been in place. One need look no further than the recently published Keywords for Gender and Sexuality Studies, which was released this past November with NYU Press. In the introduction to the text, the Keywords Feminist Editorial Collective, made up of some of today's top scholars in gender and sexuality studies, describes how they selected which terms would appear in the volume, explaining that in reaching out to, quote, fellow teachers, activists, and thinkers at the 2019 National Women's Studies Association Conference in San Francisco, unquote, they tested their intuitions about what to include and how. The response the editorial collective received prompted them to add 6 more terms to the volume. And I bet you can guess one of them, religion. It's unclear if they, quote, had any, if they had either thought not of, it is unclear if they had either not thought of or eliminated religion from the earlier list. Either way, though, the term's absence, or its almost absence, and its eventual inclusion as a result of feminist scholarly praxis, i.e. the editorial collective asking for input from the broader gender and sexuality studies scholarly community, is significant. In the resulting entry for religion in the keywords volume, Tanzan M. Ali, a scholar of religion, politics, and gender, succinctly explains, religion is still, quote, either rendered suspect in the broader struggle for gender justice or otherwise overlooked as a productive category of inquiry by feminists and queer academics and activists alike, unquote. This, ironically enough, given feminist and queer theories' orientations and commitments, results from the unmarked and still powerful hold of a Western liberal system that prizes a constellation of relationally defined values, including individualism, freedom, and capitalism. This is an ideological influence that continues to go largely unmarked when it comes to gender and sexuality studies scholars' engagement, or lack thereof, with religion. This is despite major critiques from within the field, such as Jaz Pirpuar's now classic terrorist assemblages, and Evren Savchi's more recently published Queer in Translation. Just as telling, though, is that despite 30-odd years of debate over the definition and goals of feminism and the problems with centering woman and gay as the primary objects of study in gender and sexuality studies, the now commonplace conceptualization of gender and sexuality, quote, through the prisms of racialization, coloniality, nation, and class, is one that has yet to be widely taken up in Mormon studies, and that language came from the keywords volume. Indeed, many of the often taken for granted critiques, insights, and contributions of gender and sexuality studies over the last 30-odd years cannot yet be assumed in a Mormon studies context. Some of these critiques, insights, and contributions include, as the Keywords editorial collective reminds us, that the appropriation of feminism by white liberalism has occurred, quote, without acknowledging how race, colonialism, political economy, gender, and other structural inequalities differentiate women's experiences. That feminist political concerns have often emerged in political and intellectual spaces not explicitly named or framed as feminist because they did not always foreground woman as a primary subject. That gender binarisms, such as the one that upholds biological womanhood as an essential category, are themselves in league with the project of white supremacy, which reserves normative gender identity for their white subjects, unquote. And finally, I would add intersectionality as a critical social theory. So among other analyses, interpretations, and contributions in gender sexuality studies, those are some of the main ones. This is not to ignore the important and groundbreaking work of many Mormon studies scholars, several of whom are here today, and that seek to bring these fields and disciplines and theoretical frameworks into conversation with one another. In fact, we've already heard some of that in some of the presentations. Take, for example, Suhe Vega on intersectionality, Mujerista theology, and LDS Latina experiences, or Amanda Hendricks Komodo's forthcoming book, Imperial Zions, Religion, Race, and Family in the American West and the Pacific, on LDS theology, settler colonialism, and how 19th century processes of racialization intersect with sexuality. Another example is Elise Boxer's work on whiteness and the 20th century Mormon Indian student placement program. Other examples are highlighted in Gina Colvin and Johanna Brooks's edited collection, Decolonizing Mormonism. I could go on here, but I'm worried about running over, so I'm going to cut the list short. We can talk about other examples I didn't name. As scholars of Mormonism continue to move toward a deeper engagement with gender and sexuality studies, its methods, theoretical frameworks, and commitment to praxis, we are beginning to uncover the myriad ways that Mormonism is, alongside other religious traditions and institutions, central, not peripheral, to major social and political events, both historically and contemporaneously. However, I want to caution those of us engaging gender and sexuality in Mormon studies to not limit our foci to topics or in ways which have most usually been engaged and applied already. This includes polygamy, same-sex sexuality, mainstream Mormon feminism, hegemonic Western ideas of gendered authority in theology and institutions, mixed sexuality marriages, and false oppositions between LGBTQ rights and religious freedom. While these topics are unavoidable and important, the tendency to focus in these areas and in these ways can have the unattended but nonetheless detrimental effect of reifying preoccupations about Mormonism, as well as typical binaries that have structured approaches to gender and sexuality in modern Western thought. So man versus woman, homosexual versus heterosexual, religious versus secular, etc. It makes sense that topics like 19th century polygamy and increasingly the church's 20th century heterosexist and homophobic views and policies have been the two main foci of research thus far, especially in the history of sexuality. But what about interracial sex and marriage? What about sex, work, pornography, and other sexual cultures outside of marriage? What about views and theories of non-procreative sex and pleasure? What about trans and non-binary people and experiences, which I think is especially pertinent given what's going on right now in Utah and around the country and the protest that was happening last night with trans youth at the Capitol. What about Mormon feminisms that don't center white cis American women? How do any of these questions change when we don't assume a US-centric Mormonism? For instance, how have the church's policies on gender and sexuality traveled with missionaries and other church representatives as the religion expanded globally? How have those policies come into contact with, challenged, or changed local sexual and gender cultures? Has Mormon missionizing significantly collided with the policing or securitization of national borders as those processes occur through the racially charged registers of gender and sexuality? Given the ways that Mormonism's relationship to sexuality and gender has consistently produced racial meanings, categories, and knowledges used to bolster US settler colonialism and imperial governance, it's imperative that we continue to ask these questions and others with attention to the transnational context in which Mormonism has always existed. These are but a few questions, there are many others. Wherever Mormon studies engagement of gender and sexuality goes in the future, it's going to be forever indebted to the foundational work of D. Michael Quinn. I can only hope that we learn from both his successes and shortcomings in order to, as the Keywords editorial collective encourages us to, embrace the quote, opportunity to deepen analyses of the relationships among race, gender, sexuality, nation, ability, and political economy, as foregrounded in the rich history of justice-oriented intersectional movements, and to center scholarship and acting the analyses of Black, Indigenous, and women of color feminisms, transnational feminisms, queer of color critique, trans disability and fat studies, feminist science studies, and critiques of the state law detention centers and prisons that emerge from within queer and women of color justice movements. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Next, we will hear from Cristina Rosetti, who will also be joining us from afar. Dr. Rosetti holds a PhD in religious studies from the University of California, Riverside, and is an incoming assistant professor of humanities at DSU. Her research focuses on the history and lived experience of Mormon fundamentalists in the Intermountain West and the persistence of polygamy post-1933. She currently serves on the editorial advisory board of Mormon Studies Review and the board of the Journal of Mormon History, and as the nonfiction book review editor of Dialogue.
Hello. I so wish that I could be there in person to see so many friends and colleagues, but appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you about someone who was not only one of the greatest historians in the field of Mormon studies, but a dear friend and mentor to many. I'd like to open with a section from Dr. Quinn's personal diary that he wrote in connection to a significant historiographical event that happened in 1974. In doing so, I'd also like to take this time to share that in addition to Quinn's autobiography that is being published by Signature Books, Quinn's diaries are currently being edited for publication by Brian Buchanan at Benchmark Books. I'm sure these diaries will themselves become an invaluable part of the rich history and historiography of Mormonism. On August 12th, 1974, Quinn wrote, "In the afternoon, I talked with Don Schmidt about the materials in the vault. After I had devoted much silent prayer in the day, asking the Lord to guide my words and open the way for my access. I asked Don if there was any way I could find out exactly what is in the subject files of the vault so I wouldn't have to fish around in the dark for what is there. He readily took me into Earl Olson's office, picked up the catalog cards to the vault's contents, and read off the subject titles so that I could indicate which, if any, were of interest to my research on the general authorities. And at the time, this was Quinn's dissertation research. Among the cards he read was the marriage record of 1898 to 1903, which I said I would like to see in addition to two other items of far less interest to me. He nonchalantly said, "Okay, that's 3 items. Make up cards requesting them and give them to me tomorrow." The next day, Quinn received the Hello. I so wish that I could be there in person to see so many friends and colleagues, but appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you about someone who was not only one of the greatest historians in 1974. Quinn wrote, "In the afternoon, I talked with Don Schmidt about the materials in the vault. After I had devoted much silent prayer in the day, asking the Lord to guide my words and open the way for my access. I asked Don if there was any way I could find out exactly what is in the subject files of the vault, so I wouldn't have to fish around in the dark for what is there. He readily took me into Earl Olson's office, picked up the catalog cards to the vault's contents, and read off the subject titles so that I could indicate which, if any, were of interest to my research on the general authorities. And at the time, this was Quinn's dissertation research. Among the cards he read was the marriage record of 1898 to 1903, which I said I would like to see in addition to two other items of far less interest to me. He nonchalantly said, "Okay, that's 3 items. Make up cards requesting them and give them to me tomorrow." The next day, Quinn received the marriage record he sought from the vault. When I got the marriage record, I immediately recognized it as containing post-1890 plural marriages performed by Matthias F. Cowley. This record became a vital resource for scholars of polygamy. Those being sealed by Cowley include fellow apostles Brigham Young Jr., Owen Woodruff, Mariner Merrill, and John W. Taylor, as well as stake and mission presidents. In my own work, this record became invaluable because it contained the record of future fundamentalist leader Joseph White Musser. Quinn continued, "I typed extensive notes from the marriage record, which contained the record of plural marriages performed for 50 men by Cowley, and a scrap of paper with 2 post-1890 plural marriages performed in 1903 by Apostle Rudger Clausen. I know that Cowley performed more plural marriages than these, so it seems possible that this was an incomplete collation he made, perhaps as required by his arch-opponent Francis M. Lyman. When I had finished with this record, I turned somewhat indifferently to the second item from the vault, cataloged in Earl Olson's list as George F. Richards' appointment book. I had asked for it primarily to act as a filler so that the marriage record would not be the only item I was seeking. To my surprise, I found that this record book contained a rather detailed summary of the meetings held in connection with the resignations J.W. Taylor and M.F. Cowley submitted in 1905. In none of the available diaries of the apostles or presidency has more than oblique reference been made to these meetings. Therefore, I was profoundly happy and grateful to have stumbled upon this document. I offered several silent but heartfelt prayers to God, thanking him for giving me access at last to all of the documents apparently in HDC about post-1890 polygamy. The remaining documents I seek are either in private possession or are in the vaults of the First Presidency or of Joseph Fielding Smith. When it is the Lord's will, I know he will open the way for me to obtain access to the materials. The above prayer, research, and reflection culminated in one of the most significant pieces of historical writing in the study of post-manifesto polygamy and Mormon fundamentalism. Quinn's interest in post-manifesto polygamy began at BYU when a fellow student approached him to complain about a teacher who said anyone sealed polygamously after the manifesto was an adulterer. The student's grandfather, a mission president, was sealed in this manner, authorized by Joseph F. Smith. Quinn was bothered. Polygamous sealing after the manifesto wasn't the history he heard from B.H. Roberts and Joseph Fielding Smith. To be sure, many are still unfamiliar with this history. To find answers, he took to the church archive, where he sought to understand post-manifesto polygamy, the men who performed the sealings, the subsequent discipline that came down from the church hierarchy, and the families who were silenced from official histories because their marriages were authorized a few years too late. Prior to the publication of his findings, Quinn recognized the significance of his research. He noted an assurance that there is no power on earth that will spare me from excommunication if Marquis Peterson is alive. Peterson notoriously hated discussion of post-manifesto polygamy and fundamentalism. The stakes were high for someone whose church membership and faith mattered. But in the spirit of his mentor and church historian Leonard J. Arrington, a history true to the people who lived it mattered at least as much. So despite his concern, he published in nearly 100 pages LDS Church Authority and New Plural Marriages 1890 to 1904 in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. The article, it's 97 pages, raised and answered questions about the ambiguous period between 1890 and 1904 and showed in great detail that despite 13 and a half years and over 24 documents denying the continuation of the practice, polygamy continued after the LDS Church's end to the controversial marriage system. Much can be said about this article. I'd like to focus on one specific aspect, what he told us about Matthias F. Cowley and what it reveals about the way Quinn told history. In 1909, Joseph Musser, the man who became the leader of the Mormon fundamentalist movement, met with the Quorum of the 12 in the Salt Lake City Temple for a disciplinary hearing. Musser was a polygamist who was sealed to his second wife under the sealing authority of Matthias F. Cowley in 1902. We know this, or we first knew it, because of Quinn. During the meeting, Musser met with several men who themselves either solemnized plural marriages or married plural wives after the manifesto. Before learning these names from Musser's diary, which continue to remain restricted in the Church Historical Department, I knew the names from Quinn: John Henry Smith, Rudger Clausen, Heber J. Grant, and Anthony W. Ivins. In his longest journal entry to date, Musser gave a detailed overview of the 2-hour interaction where he was, quote, the object of inquisition to get information regarding the practice of plural marriage since the discontinuance thereof by the church. Musser recounted, "My own feelings are these, that the investigation along the lines it is being carried out is unwarranted, that the quorum is not united, and that such actions as these will tend to lose them their influence among the saints. Brother Grant said they were going to cut Brother Higgs off from the church, and his tone and manner was vindictive. My impressions were that the brethren are not activated by the proper spirit. I can't understand the attitude of some of my brethren, but am willing to leave all for final working out of our God, seeking to be a humble instrument in his hands at all times in doing good." The lack of uniform policy was only exacerbated by the unlikelihood that further discipline would come from Musser's stake president, William H. Smart, who was similarly an unrepentant polygamist. When Musser noted the quorum was not united, he spoke of the stark reality that the quorum of the 12 and the leadership of the church generally was divided over plural marriage. This was most clearly manifest in the resignation of Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor, who were found, quote, out of harmony with the quorum only 3 years before Musser's meeting. Contrary to what some have written about Musser's life, even after his plural sealings in 1902 and later in 1907, Musser's 1909 meeting did not result in church discipline. Quinn's work affirmed what many knew from family keepsakes and genealogical stories. Polygamy after the manifesto was not relegated to the other Mormons, the bad religious, like Lawrence C. Woolley and his Council of Friends. However, as the church sought to, in the words of Mary Ann Watson, convince a doubting nation about the end of polygamy, something needed to be sacrificed. In Quinn's words, Apostle Taylor and Cowley may have been scapegoats to satisfy anti-Mormons and to protect the church. These weren't rogue men. They were men whose stories were disappeared into an archival record. Of course, this had consequences. Quinn notes that the descendants of authorized post-manifesto polygamists have suffered from the church's effort to maintain consistency by branding these marriages unauthorized. To be sure, many were unauthorized, but many were authorized, thousands, according to Quinn's research. Silences are more powerful than absences in the telling of history because they are overt exercises of power. Quinn knew this well. In framing Cowley and Taylor as scapegoats in Mormonism's path toward secularity, he made loud a historic silence. It is within these spaces of silence and absence that histories are found. Entire communities, entire people are found in Cowley's record book. When Quinn broke open the records of 1,000 post-manifesto sealings, he opened the record of 1,000 people bound for eternity by priesthood and belief. Everyone had an opinion about Quinn's article. For scholars of Mormon fundamentalism, the record of Matthias Cowley and others was significant. It made tangible the ambiguous period after the manifesto. For fundamentalists, the history was a vindication, a reckoning even, that their families were valid. Some former members of the church called it an expose, and many faithful Latter-day Saints struggled with the history. Many still struggle with the history. All of these things were realities Quinn knew because he grappled with them all. He brought empathy to the telling of history. He explained, the resulting situation caused significant segments of the Mormon church to function in cognitive dissonance for prolonged periods of time. We can ignore the past. We can even deny it, but we cannot escape its intrusion upon our faithful history. History is what we are able to discover of the past. Historical fantasy is what we wish had occurred. The past was not something to be silenced or disappeared. God commanded a record kept among the saints, and that record needed to be told. As Arrington said to his research assistants, including Quinn, warts and all. In Phantoms of Remembrance, Patrick Geary writes about the haunting presence of the dead as the primary concern of history. He questions whether our ghosts are those preserved in the historical record or the individuals who maintain the record. Behind this question is the problem of who creates history and whether there is an intention in creating specific versions of the past. History is made, it is not a given, and it is always made by a haunted people. Quinn's work exemplified the scholar's inseparable connection to this reality. For Quinn, telling history was a sacred practice. That is why he ended his discussion of post-manifesto polygamy with a testimony that despite the history, he maintained, Jesus the Christ restored the church with all its authority, exalting doctrine, and ordinances to the earth through living prophets. History was deeply connected to who he was and a faith that made the redemption of the dead part of its mission. As Lindsay Hansen Park has discussed in reference to her own work, redeeming the dead through his writing of Cowley, Taylor, Woolley, and others, Quinn sought the fulfillment of this mission. He brought Cowley and his companions up from the dust and redeemed their history. Dr. Quinn is foundational to the literature on post-manifesto polygamy. More than his work, he as a scholar and faithful Mormon is deeply part of the historiography. Quinn ended his article by noting that men like John W. Woolley, Samuel Eastman, and Judson Tolman solemnized plural marriages without the first presidency's approval. Those pesky, unauthorized plural marriages. Joseph Musser's own third marriage was solemnized in his home by Tolman in 1907. Prior to his death, Quinn planned a book that expanded his work on post-manifesto polygamy to 1925, under contract with University of Utah Press. His plan was to focus on LDS marriages and not wade into the waters of those who split from the institutional church. In his words, I don't want to be one of those polemical writers. But speaking of these marriages, the fundamentalist marriages, Quinn closed by telling readers that the rest of the story remains to be told. This began with the groundbreaking work of Brian Hales, Craig Foster, Marian Watson, and Martha Bradley. I am hopeful that the many of us who write about these other sealings and other Mormons continue to tell the story that remained to be told, always pointing back to Quinn and the foundation he laid. May he live eternal in our field. Thank you.
Cristina and Ian, if you can turn on your cameras, you can join the Q&A. Let's see.
It says we can't.
Okay, let me make you a co-host and Ian. Co-host. Okay, now can you turn on your videos?
So I can't yet, Ben.
All right, Christina's on, try again. Oh, there we go. All right.
Okay.
Great. Welcome, Christina and Ian from afar. We're glad to have you join us.
Kia ora.
Thank you for all of your presentations. I'm going to start by looking for questions from our digital audience. There aren't any yet. Okay, digital audience, now is your chance. I am watching for your questions. Okay, so we will turn to our in-person audience. Who would like to ask a question? Right here from Katie Rich.
I have a question for conversation. So, reference that Quinn kept his focus at elite white men and didn't do a lot with women's history. That surprised me because I view him as being having an essential voice in women's history, not in the personal and material history, but in their role in the community. Where we can speak a little bit there, like his work with the Reform of the Anointed and succession crisis stuff and the role that women played in shaping boards and events.
Okay, yeah, so the question for our online people was, so Katie was saying she was surprised by my characterization that he focused just on elite white men because of the important scholarship that he did in terms of the role of women in the anointed quorum and the shaping of quorums. I think that's absolutely right. So I was thinking, and I probably should have been more clear, I was thinking especially of his work in the hierarchy series and so forth, where women are quite absent, I think. Certainly relegate, I think they at best are in a kind of secondary position. I think there's no doubt he has some really important articles, the article that Maxine mentioned, some of the other work that he did. So I think maybe I should think a little bit more holistically about this. But I'd still say that I think he's still, I think the focus is on the men. Other people can disagree with me, and I'd love to have that conversation. I think it's there for him. It's in terms of women's roles in the anointed quorum, women's roles shaping there. I think it's there, but it seems to me that he keeps coming back to those ordained ecclesiastical elites who have ecclesiastical position. That seems to be the center of his focus when he's thinking explicitly about leadership and hierarchy. But maybe we'll have to talk about that some more. So.
Okay. Still not seeing any Q&A from our digital audience, so we'll stick with those in the audience. Over here.
I wonder if Patrick and Ian care to say anything. I don't think this is completely tangential about a parallel book that we're reading, and that is John Brooks' Designers Fire. How things fits in? Does it integrate it? Does it work or not? Anyway.
And I will again let Patrick restate that question and then also invite Ian's
Yeah, why don't
answer.
we have Ian take it first? Do you want to restate it? And then Ian take it first?
I need you to restate the question because I wasn't listening because I know you would.
You were doing your other job. Okay, so the question was, can we think about John Brooks' important book, Refiner's Fire, and how it might relate to Quinn's work on the magic worldview? Ian, do you care to take that first, since that was primarily your topic?
Sure.
Which one? This? Okay.
Sure. Can you hear me?
I can. Try again.
Okay, cool. Coming through?
Yes.
Okay, all good. So I haven't read Brooks's book for a little while. I do know it, and I am familiar with his argument. For Brooks, my recollection is, I guess, from the perspective of the treasure-seeking lore, that he sees treasure as kind of peripheral and as a part of the larger theme that he explores. So, I mean, I think, as I recall, what Brooks has to say is interesting and important. It is of value. I guess I see it as perhaps less relevant to our understanding of, you know, the sort of the broader influence of some of those environmental, cultural matters and influences on the young Joseph Smith.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Ian. I would just say that my reading of Brooke is that what he does that Quinn didn't was really look at the transatlantic context, some of these broader contexts. And I think Quinn's project was maybe more specifically zeroed in on Joseph Smith and the Smith family and that early generations of Mormonism. Brooke, in some ways, I think takes a wider view, a transatlantic view, and a longer historical view as well. In some ways, I have a lot to say about Brooke's book, but maybe we'll keep focusing on Mike's scholarship here. So.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from our digital audience. Okay, so this is a comment I'll share. I especially love Cristina and Ian's presentations. I'm very happy to attend, even though I'm 1,800 miles away. We're so happy to have a broad digital audience and participants. And then we have another question for Patrick. What areas of Quinn's historical interests do you see as important to further historical study? But I think that's a question we can put to our entire panel. So Katie, do you want to start with that? Well, okay, sure. So what areas of Quinn's historical interest do you see as important to further historical study? And then Cristina, Ian, Patrick, anyone who wants to jump in after Katie, please feel free.
My answer is going to be rather simplistic. I think all of it. I know that's a cop-out answer, but at least in the realms that I am working in, although same-sex dynamics and his work on post-manifesto polygamy is older at this point, other people have written on it. I think us as a panel have pointed out that a lot of scholars keep coming back to his fundamental points and that they serve as a core around which current work is continuing to be produced. So I would say, especially same-sex dynamics and that post-polygamy work is especially important.
Cristina or Ian, I'm going to hold the mics for you if you'd like to jump in.
I just want to mention that I saw someone in the chat asked about Mike Quinn's U of U Press post-manifesto polygamy book. That is something that I think, you know, most people would want to see. If you haven't read the dialogue article, I want to go ahead and recommend everyone does. But that Brian Buchanan, again, who's doing the journals, he has talked with the university, like he has all the information about the state of that book. And so there is going to be an attempt to publish it for Mike. So that's kind of something that I'm excited for. And I think, you know, there's a lot left to be said about post-manifesto polygamy, the involvement behind it. And he had all of it. So hopefully that.
Ian, any comments from you?
Do you want to just quickly repeat the question, Barbara? I think sleep deprivation is coming in for me over the time zones.
That's okay. Somebody just asked in the chat, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. They asked what Quinn's work can do to further the historical study of Mormonism and the issues that he started working on, that he pioneered, how that will continue to forward things going forward.
Sure. I think, I think Patrick hit the nail on the head, really, in terms of Quinn's probably single most important contribution, and that is those massive sources and footnotes that Cristina referred to as well. I mean, what Quinn has given us across magic, across hierarchy, is just sort of these massive sources that he pulls together, brings together in ways that people have contested and may well debate, but that no one else has really brought together before. And I think going forward, I mean, the challenge for those of us now perhaps are to bring new theoretical and perhaps intellectual approaches to those sources, but to also recognize, respect, and use this fantastic research that Mike was able to undertake, and to undertake like no one else. As Cristina and Patrick have noted, he had access to archival resources from the early 1970s that no one will ever see again, probably, at least some of them, and you know, just has this produced this just amazing body of source work, some really valuable interpretations, but perhaps most valuable just for giving us these extraordinary connections and sources that going forward, I think people can bring hopefully new ideas, new understandings, new intellectual approaches to maybe fulfill what Mike might have anticipated.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm sorry, there's a few of you, but I invite you to come and talk to Katie and Patrick after who are here. But we'll just take one more question over here and then we'll need to conclude.
In the Beinecke Library, the 300 boxes that make up the Quinn collection, the first 30 are from 1988 and are his research papers before that are his summary, sometimes his quotes, as just referred to, of information that's not available now. My own index that I created. I'm wondering if any of the participants have gone through and have created their own indexes. Maybe there could be a collaborative working together to share information to make it easier for people to access Quinn's information that is now less available than it used to be.
Okay, so briefly restating the question, there is a collection of Mike Quinn's resources at the Beinecke Library with a list of the sources and so forth. And the question was, are there others who might be willing to share sources like Mike that we as a historical community can access? So anyone of our participants want to comment on that?
I think it's a great idea. I don't know that anybody's done that yet. I mean, it's an enormous collection. It'd be so valuable. I don't know if anybody's doing that.
So Patrick Mason's answer was he's not sure if anyone is doing that. Anyone else on the panel care to comment?
I'm not a historian, so my people are all alive walking around.
Okay. All right. I think that brings us to the end of this wonderful session. Will you please join me in thanking our panelists for their work? Okay, it is now time for lunch, and Ben Park is giving me the thumbs up. We have enough lunches for everyone here, whether you registered beforehand or not. Yes. So please help yourself to a lunchbox. Enjoy. Thank you.